Sloan. Steam curled across the glass of the shower, clouding the world beyond into a misty blur. Sloan pressed her body against the cool tile wall, water streaming over their skin, mingling heat with heat. His lips traced a slow path down her neck, lingering at her collarbone before claiming the curve of her breast. She gasped as his tongue teased her nipple, teeth grazing just enough to send a shiver rippling through her spine. The sensation was sharper, rawer, than anything she'd ever felt, not from her husband's hurried hands, not even from the toys hidden in her dresser drawer. This was alive. This was dangerous. Her fingers threaded through his damp hair, guiding him lower. He eased her onto the shower bench, spreading her legs as water drummed around them. When his mouth found her, she cried out, muffling the sound against her wrist. His tongue moved with deliberate skill, circling, pressing, humming against her until her thighs tightened around his neck. She tried to hold back, tried to control the flood that rose inside her, but it broke through, leaving her trembling, her breath ragged. He looked up at her then, grinning as though he'd stolen a secret. His hand stroked himself lazily, thick and heavy, as though the promise of what came next was inevitable. She met his gaze, breathless, wanting more, needing more. He leaned close, lips brushing her ear. "Tell me," he whispered, "do you want to be loved or made love to?" Her answer was wordless. She pulled him to her, kissing him with a hunger that left no room for doubt. He lifted her effortlessly, her legs wrapping around his waist as he carried her to the bed. There was no rush, no fumbling, only the slow revelation of her body beneath his touch. When he entered her, she gasped, clutching at him as if afraid he might disappear. His strokes were deliberate, teasing at first, then plunging deep, each movement pulling a sound from her lips she didn't know she could make. He studied her face as though memorizing every flicker of pleasure, every surrender. For the first time in years, she felt seen, desired, alive. Later, as sleep claimed her, he kissed her forehead. Quietly, he dressed, tucking a single rose onto the pillow beside her before slipping out into the night. Morning came with a shaft of sunlight spilling across the sheets. She stirred, reaching instinctively to the other side of the bed, but found only cool emptiness. A single rose lay upon the pillow, crimson against the white linen, its stem wrapped with a silk ribbon. Her lips curved into a smile that carried equal parts wonder and confusion. She lifted the rose, inhaling its fragrance, replaying the night in her mind. His voice still lingered in her ear, his touch branded across her skin. But he was gone. No note, no number, only the rose. It should have left her hollow, abandoned, but instead she felt alive. Renewed. For the first time in years, her body ached not from longing but from satisfaction. She whispered his name as though testing the sound of it, like a secret only she was meant to hold. Johnson Sloan. And thus began the whispers. The stories of the man who loved women for a night, left them with a rose, and vanished into the city before dawn. A shadow, a fantasy, a mystery. Locked. In. The latch clicked uselessly as Sloan tugged at the handle again. "Stuck," he muttered, giving the knob a firm twist. Mrs. Smith knelt at his side, already pulling a letter opener from his desk. "Maybe we can jimmy it." The sight of her on her knees, skirt tugging against the curve of her hips, made his breath catch. He forced himself to look away, to focus on the lock instead of the way her blouse slipped open just enough when she leaned forward. She worked the opener with delicate precision, brows furrowed in concentration. Sloan stood over her, one hand braced against the frame, the other resting near his thigh. From her angle, she couldn't help noticing the way his tailored trousers stretched. An outline she tried to tell herself was imagination. "Not working," she said, sitting back on her heels. Her voice trembled with a frustration that had little to do with the door. "Try this." Sloan pulled a paperclip from his desk, bending it with quick fingers before crouching down beside her. Close now, Closer than they should have been, he handed it over, their fingertips brushing. She swallowed, turning back to the lock. Her pulse drummed in her ears. The clip scratched softly against the mechanism as she worked, her mind racing faster than her hands. He was watching her. She felt it, heavy on her skin. "You know," he said, voice low, "most people would call maintenance." "And miss the adventure," she countered, glancing up at him with a faint grin. His lips curved. Their eyes locked, and for a heartbeat the room shrank to just them, the faint hum of the city beyond the glass, the warmth of bodies too close, the shared awareness of a line neither dared cross. She bent again, pretending focus. But as she shifted, her shoulder brushed his leg. The contact was fleeting, accidental, yet it sent a spark racing through her. Her breath hitched. Oh God, it's real. The thought was as dangerous as it was intoxicating. For 7 years, her husband had looked right past her, through her even, but this man, this stranger, had her body betraying her in seconds. The lock finally gave way with a metallic snap. The door creaked open. Relief and disappointment warred within her. "See," she said, forcing levity into her tone as she rose. "No adventure lasts forever." Sloan held the door open, but his gaze lingered. "Some are worth remembering, though." Her cheeks flushed. She stepped into the hall, her stride brisk, her heart anything but. Back in her own office, she closed the door and leaned against it, chest rising and falling. The image of him towered in her mind, his eyes, his voice, the unmistakable presence of what she had felt against her shoulder. She crossed the room, blinds snapping shut with a tug. Alone in the dim silence, she dropped into her chair and buried her face in her hands. She told herself it was madness, that she was imagining what she wanted to feel. But her body told her otherwise. But for her, it was more than just a story. It was the beginning of an obsession. Fractures. Mrs. Smith paced the length of her office, papers untouched on her desk, the city skyline glaring back at her through the glass. Her body still hummed from the near touch, the brush of fabric against Sloan's leg, the weight of his gaze when the lock finally surrendered. "What am I doing?" She pressed her palms against the cool surface of her desk, steadying herself. 7 years of marriage had taught her to keep her desires buried, smoothed over beneath duty and routine. Charles, her husband, had once been attentive, opening doors, surprising her with flowers, making her laugh until her cheeks ached. Now, he barely looked up from his phone when she walked into a room. And then there was Sloan. A man she had known for less than a week, who had unsettled her more in an hour than Charles had managed in years. Her reflection in the glass startled her. She studied herself as though she were a stranger. The sweep of her red blouse against her dark skin, the curve of her hips framed by a pencil skirt. She had chosen the outfit for professionalism, yet she couldn't deny the thrill she felt when Sloan's eyes lingered a second too long. She sank into her chair, clasping her hands tightly to keep them from trembling. The memory of his voice replayed, low and smooth. Some adventures are worth remembering. Her heart thudded, betraying her. A knock at the door startled her upright. Her assistant peeked in, a folder in hand. "Just wanted to check if you needed anything else before I head out for lunch." Mrs. Smith shook her head quickly. "No, thank you, that'll be all." The door closed again, leaving her alone with silence and temptation. She leaned back, closing her eyes. Every instinct told her to put Sloan out of her mind, to return to her spreadsheets, to think about anything else. But desire, once awakened, was a stubborn guest. It refused to leave quietly. Her fingers drifted unconsciously to the single button undone at her blouse, tracing the hollow of her throat. She stopped herself, dropping her hands to her lap. Not yet. Not here. But the thought lingered, dangerous and sweet. What if I let myself want this? Evening draped itself over the Smith home like a tired blanket. The kitchen smelled faintly of reheated pasta, the kind Charles had picked up on his way home. He was at the table, scrolling through his phone, his fork moving absently from plate to mouth without ever lifting his eyes. "Long day?" she asked, sliding her purse onto the counter. He murmured, not looking up. "Merger stuff." She hesitated. "Yes." It was the truth, in a way, but the weight of what she didn't say pressed heavy on her chest. She sat across from him, resting her chin on her palm, waiting for him to notice her blouse, her hair, the subtle glow still clinging to her skin. He didn't. After dinner, he retreated to the living room, television flickering against his face while he tapped through messages. She lingered in the kitchen, fingers drumming lightly against the counter. Each sound of his laughter at something on his phone was another reminder of the distance between them. By the time she slipped into the bedroom, he was already half asleep, sprawled across the mattress with one arm draped over his stomach. She changed quietly, the red blouse falling to the floor, replaced by silk that felt cool against her overheated skin. She lay beside him, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. Once, that sound had been comforting. Now, it only reminded her how alone she felt with him lying inches away. Her mind betrayed her, painting Sloan's face against the darkness. The intensity in his eyes, the way his voice had curled low in her ear. The weight of him standing too close, the heat of the air that seemed to shift when he looked at her. Her thighs pressed together unconsciously. She turned onto her side, facing away from Charles, pulling the blanket high to cover the small movements of her hand. Fingers traced down her stomach, slow, hesitant, as though even in the dark she feared being caught. Her breath quickened, shallow and sharp, as she closed her eyes and let herself slip into the memory of Sloan. The way he smiled when she bent over the lock, the brush of his leg against her shoulder. The voice, maybe it's a sign. Her body responded before she could stop it, arching, trembling against the sheets as her lips pressed into the pillow to stifle a cry. When it was over, she lay still, chest heaving, the silence of the room pressing in once more. Charles stirred beside her, rolling onto his side without waking. His arm draped over her waist loosely, unknowing, unfeeling. She stared into the dark, the ache of guilt mixing with something sharper, hungrier. It was more than just desire. It was the realization that, for the first time in years, she felt alive. Sloan's loft was quiet, save for the low hum of the city through the windows. He stood at the bar counter, pouring 2 fingers of whiskey into a glass, watching the amber swirl as though the liquid might reveal the future. Another rose sat in the vase on the counter, still wrapped in ribbon. He always kept one on hand, a calling card, a signature, something women could remember him by when he slipped back into the shadows. He lifted the glass, savoring the burn, and thought of Mrs. Smith. It wasn't unusual for him to notice a woman, her scent, her confidence, the hunger just beneath her polished exterior. But there had been something different about her. She wasn't chasing him like the others. She wasn't whispering about him in hushed referrals, as though he were some secret pleasure passed from one to the next. She was restrained, composed, yet the pulse in her throat had told another story. He smiled faintly, setting the glass down. He knew the signs, he had made a study of them. Desire was predictable, loneliness even more so, and women like Mrs. Smith, successful, beautiful, bound by obligation, were the easiest to unravel once temptation brushed too close. But this wasn't about conquest, not entirely. Sloan had rules, though few believed it. He didn't pursue, he offered. A glance, a touch, an opening, if they stepped through, it was their choice. He was the spark, never the flame. At least, that was what he told himself. His phone buzzed, flashing Nicole's name. He let it ring once, twice, then swiped. "You're quiet tonight," she teased, her voice dripping with practiced sweetness. "Busy," he said, eyes drifting back to the city lights. "Too busy for me." He smiled, though she couldn't see it. Never too busy, but some adventures, they take patience. Nicole laughed softly, a sound that once thrilled him but now barely stirred anything at all. He let her speak, half listening, his thoughts wandering back to Mrs. Smith. The way she had bent over his door, the curve of her lips when she smiled despite herself. The subtle war in her eyes, want battling against restraint. He had seen it before, he knew how it ended. Still, something about her felt different. He set the phone down before Nicole finished her story, her voice muffled against the counter as he stared at the skyline. The whiskey burned less this time. Sloan leaned back in his chair, a whisper of a grin tugging at his mouth. Mrs. Smith might resist today, she might even resist tomorrow. But in the end, everyone broke. The hotel room smelled faintly of jasmine and expensive perfume. The woman, Simone, a referral from Nicole, laughed softly as she slipped out of her heels, her dress falling in a satin pool around her ankles. "You're even more handsome than she said," she murmured, stepping closer. Sloan offered a practiced smile, the one that never reached his eyes but always disarmed. "And you're exactly as described." She blushed, though he had meant it as nothing more than an easy line. They always did. He guided her to the bed with the same confidence he carried into boardrooms, hands steady, touch deliberate. She melted into him quickly, as they always did. His mouth found hers, his body pressed firm against her curves, and soon the air was thick with sighs and whispers. It was mechanical, efficient, the same dance he had performed 100 times before. And yet, as she kissed his throat, murmuring his name like a prayer, his mind wandered. He thought of Mrs. Smith, her laugh when the door finally gave way, the way her eyes betrayed her, even as her words remained professional. He thought of her red blouse, the subtle flush that had spread across her skin when their bodies drew too close. For the first time in years, Sloan faltered. The woman beneath him noticed, her brows lifting slightly. Something wrong. He shook his head, slipping easily back into rhythm. Not at all. She accepted the answer, lost again in the illusion he built around her. But in his mind, the image of Mrs. Smith lingered, stubborn as smoke. When it was over, he left quietly, as he always did, placing a single rose on the pillow beside her. She would wake to the crimson bloom, tell herself she had been chosen special. Another story in a chain of whispered confessions passed between women who knew his name. But Sloan didn't look back. On the drive home, the city lights blurred past his windshield. Simone was already fading into memory, her perfume dissolving into the night. What unsettled him wasn't her forgettability, it was the fact that she was forgettable. Mrs. Smith, however, she refused to fade. Morning light spilled across the office, sharp and unforgiving. Mrs. Smith adjusted her blazer before stepping into the elevator, the mirrored walls reflecting a woman who looked calm, composed, unshaken. But beneath the surface, she wasn't. The memory of last night clung to her like perfume, the silence of her bedroom, Charles's steady, oblivious breathing, and the way she had turned away from him, surrendering to thoughts she shouldn't have allowed. Thoughts of Sloan. She pressed her lips together, forcing herself to focus as the elevator doors opened. Staff moved briskly through the halls, carrying files and coffee, their chatter blending into a hum. She offered nods, polite smiles, practiced authority. And then she saw him. Sloan stood near the glass wall of his office, speaking with 2 associates. His suit was perfectly cut, his posture relaxed, his smile just enough to command attention without seeming to ask for it. He looked every bit the professional, untouched by the heat that had nearly consumed her in that locked room. When his gaze flicked up and caught hers, her breath faltered. A brief pause, a half-second too long, and then he returned to his conversation as though nothing had passed between them. She turned quickly, pretending to study the notes in her hand. But her heart betrayed her, thudding against her ribs. The rest of the day was a blur. Meetings, reports, calls, she was present, but never fully there. Every time she heard his voice down the hall, every time he passed her door, she felt the air shift. Even when she wasn't looking, she was aware of him, as though her body had mapped the very gravity of his presence. By mid-afternoon, she found herself in the ladies' room, gripping the sink, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Get it together. The woman who looked back at her was still in control, her hair immaculate, her makeup unflawed, her expression composed, but her eyes gave her away. They were restless, searching, hungry. Mrs. Smith. The voice startled her. One of the junior associates had stepped in, glancing at her with polite concern. She straightened immediately. Yes. Just wanted to confirm if you'll be attending the late strategy session with Mr. Sloan. The words hit harder than they should have. She nodded, her voice steady. I'll be there. The associate smiled and left, the door swinging shut behind her. Mrs. Smith exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the sink once more. A late session, alone with him again. The thought terrified her, the thought thrilled her. Beneath the surface, the strategy session began with spreadsheets and projections, the kind of dry material that normally demanded her full attention. Mrs. Smith sat across the conference table from Sloan, her pen poised, notes neatly aligned. On the surface, everything was professional. But beneath it, everything burned. His voice filled the room, low and measured, explaining figures, outlining market risks. She nodded, contributing when needed, forcing her words into the language of business. Yet each time he looked at her, really looked, she felt her composure tremble. At one point, he leaned across the table to slide a chart toward her. Their hands brushed, brief, accidental, but enough to send a current racing through her veins. Apologies, he said smoothly, though his eyes lingered a fraction too long. It's fine, she replied, keeping her tone even. But her pulse betrayed her, a drumbeat she prayed he couldn't hear. Minutes stretched into an hour. The building emptied slowly, voices fading down hallways, leaving only the muffled hum of the city outside. By the time the last associate excused himself, gathering his laptop and papers, it was just the two of them. The silence thickened. Mrs. Smith adjusted her glasses, focusing hard on the report in front of her. We'll need to restructure this section, she said, pointing to the figures. Otherwise, the projections won't hold for Q3. Agreed, Sloan replied, sliding into the chair beside her instead of across. Show me where you'd adjust. Her throat tightened. He was close now, close enough that she could smell the faint spice of his cologne. She forced herself to lower her eyes to the page, tracing the numbers with her pen. His shoulder brushed hers lightly, unintentional or not. She kept speaking, though her voice dipped softer. Here, if we stagger the rollouts, we can absorb any fluctuation. Smart, he said, his tone casual. But when she glanced sideways, his gaze wasn't on the numbers, it was on her. She cleared her throat, shifting slightly. It's late, we should. Yes, he said, a pause. But some things are worth staying late for. Her breath caught. The air between them was no longer neutral. It was charged, weighted, thick with unspoken possibility. The spell broke when her phone buzzed. She snatched it quickly, Charles's name glowing on the screen. A missed call. She let it ring out, muttering, I'll return it later. Sloan leaned back, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Duty calls. Yes, she said, her voice strained. Duty always calls. But her eyes betrayed her again, flicking to his mouth before she could stop herself. He noticed. He always noticed. Silence between them. The house was quiet when Mrs. Smith returned, too quiet. Charles was in the den, his attention fixed on the glow of the television. A sports commentator's voice filled the air, clashing with the hollow rhythm of her heels on the hardwood floor. She lingered in the doorway for a moment, waiting, hoping for him to look up. He didn't. "Long day," she said, setting her purse down. He answered, eyes never leaving the screen. She pressed her lips together, swallowing words that would have only bounced against his indifference. She walked to the kitchen, reheated leftovers, and set them on the table. He joined her minutes later, eating absently, scrolling through his phone between bites. She tried. She told him about the merger, about the late session, about projections and strategy. But her words fell flat, swallowed by the clink of silverware and the glow of his screen. When he finally glanced up, it wasn't at her face. It was at the clock. "I've got an early call tomorrow," he said, pushing his chair back. And just like that, the evening was over. In bed, she lay stiff beneath the sheets, listening to his steady breathing. She had showered, dressed in silk, brushed her hair the way he used to like it. But Charles had kissed her forehead absently before turning onto his side, already halfway to sleep. Her eyes burned, though no tears came. She closed them, but her mind refused to rest. It replayed the day in stolen fragments. Sloan's hand brushing hers, the way he leaned too close over the numbers, the low cadence of his voice when he said some things were worth staying late for. Her thighs pressed together under the blanket. Her body ached with unspoken need, her skin tingling with the memory of a man she had no right to think about. Beside her, Charles stirred once, murmured something incoherent, then settled back into his unbroken rhythm. She turned away from him, facing the dark, her pulse still racing with thoughts she couldn't bury. The silence between them was suffocating. And for the first time, she wondered if she wanted it to break at all, or if she preferred the dangerous, forbidden noise that Sloan had awakened in her.